This is not a story about sex, and it is not a story about morality. What I am about to share with you is far more unsettling, because it is about how human beings lose control of their own lives without realizing it. This talk is for a very specific audience, for those who feel their life is repeating, for those who feel strangely empty when stimulation disappears, for those who enter relationships intensely, only to watch them collapse in familiar ways, and most importantly, for those who have ever asked themselves, why can't I stop? Let me be precise. The problem is not behavior. The problem is the structure that produces the behavior. In Western culture, we are often told a comforting lie. Just use willpower. Just make better choices. The behavioral science tells us something very different. Once a pattern is repeated enough, it is no longer a decision. It becomes a system. So the real question is not, why am I doing this? The real question is, am I choosing or am I reacting? Because if you cannot answer that question clearly, you are not living a life of choice. You are living a life of repetition. Now let's go deeper. There is an ancient framework that describes this phenomenon with unsettling precision, not as religion, but as a psychological map of the human mind. It explains one simple principle. Unobserved patterns repeat themselves. Not sometimes, always. What you call your habits are not random. They are the visible surface of an invisible architecture, a loop made of desire, reinforcement, and emotional avoidance. And over time, this loop becomes stronger, more automatic, more dominant, until one day it defines your entire life. Let's examine how this happens. Every addiction, whether it's sex, alcohol, or consumption, follows the same trajectory. It begins as pleasure, then it becomes habit, and eventually it becomes dependency. At that final stage, the equation flips. You are no longer doing it to feel good. You are doing it because you cannot tolerate not doing it. That is the moment when control is lost. Now here is where it becomes critical. This is not just about behavior. It is about what happens to your life over time. Patterns formed in your teens and 20s do not disappear. They mature. And by the time you reach your 40s, they solidify into structural consequences. We see 4 recurring outcomes: financial instability, unstable relationships, chronic fatigue, and the most dangerous of all, emotional emptiness, especially for those who rely on stimulation, including sexual stimulation as emotional regulation. This emptiness becomes deeper with age because the brain adapts. What once felt intense now feels ordinary, and what feels ordinary feels unbearable. So what is really happening here? From a clinical perspective, we are not looking at one issue. We are looking at an overlap of 3 systems. First, behavioral addiction, a compulsive loop driven by reward. Second, impulse control deficit, the inability to delay gratification. Third, and most importantly, a deeper personality structure, characterized by emotional instability and chronic emptiness. When these 3 intersect, you don't just get bad habits. You get a repeating life pattern. Let me simplify the mechanism. The loop looks like this: desire, action, reward, emptiness. Desire again. And here is the key insight. This loop is not driven by pleasure. It is driven by the inability to tolerate emptiness. That is why people return to the same behaviors. Not because they are weak, but because their internal system has learned, without this, I cannot feel okay. Now we need to address a common misconception. When people observe this pattern, they often make a moral judgment. This person lacks discipline. This person is irresponsible. But psychology tells us something far more nuanced. Behind these behaviors, we often find unresolved emotional wounds, attachment instability, a fragmented sense of self-worth. So the real question is not, why are they behaving like this? The real question is, what are they trying to escape? Because every compulsive behavior is solving a problem, even if it is creating a bigger one. Now let's bring in neuroscience. Activities like sex, alcohol, and impulsive consumption. trigger powerful dopamine responses. At first, this creates pleasure, but over time, the brain recalibrates. The baseline shifts, and eventually, the person reaches a state where normal life feels unbearably dull. At this point, the issue is no longer behavioral. It is neurological. The reward system itself has been altered, which is why change becomes so difficult. You are not just fighting habits. You are fighting a rewired brain. But here is where this conversation changes direction, because everything I've said so far might sound deterministic. It might sound like there is no way out, but that is not true. There is one capacity that changes everything, and it is something most people never develop. It is the ability to observe your own mind, not control it, not suppress it, but see it clearly, because the moment you can observe a pattern, you create distance from it. And the moment there is distance, there is possibility. This is the turning point. You move from, I am my desires, to, I am aware of my desires. And that shift, however small it seems, is the beginning of freedom. Because what you can observe, you are no longer fully controlled by. So let me leave you with this. Your life is not defined by what you feel. It is defined by what you repeatedly do. And what you repeatedly do is shaped by what you are not aware of. So the question is not, do I have desires? Of course you do. The question is, am I choosing my desires? Or are my desires choosing me? Because if you avoid that question, your life will repeat. But if you confront it honestly, deeply, that is where change begins. If this perspective challenged the way you see your life, I invite you to stay with this conversation. Subscribe, share, and engage, because the next part will take this even further. We will move beyond theory into real-world consequences. Relationships, marriage, collapse, and whether stability is even possible within this structure. Until then, ask yourself one thing. Where is this pattern taking me? And more importantly, do I still have the power to change its direction?